Imagine you're only 13 years old and one day you leave your house to run a normal errand, but one of your neighbors surprises you, and after that, you never return home. Your family searches for you for hours, and after searching with a desperate hope of finding you alive, the only thing they find is your body. This was the case of a young girl in Argentina that I'll be telling you about today. If you want to know everything that happened, stay with me until the end of the video. Hello everyone, how are you? My name is Lesma. I hope you're doing very well. As always, I'm very happy to be here with you for another day. Very grateful that you're watching me wherever you may be. Today we have a case that happened in Argentina, that of Sol Celina Gomez Montiel. Join me to see all the details. Sol Celina Gomez Montiel was born around the year 2012 in Chaco, a province in northern Argentina. She shared her days with her mother Micaela and her grandmother Julia, one of the most important people in her life. Those who knew her remember her as a very quiet, studious, polite, and affectionate girl. She liked going to school, to church, and hanging out with her neighborhood friends. Generally speaking, she led a very simple life, marked by routines and small habits. Besides that, she also really liked music, and in fact, was part of her church's dance group. In the neighborhood where she lived, everyone knew her. Sol was part of that everyday environment where each family watches the others grow up over time. Among the neighbors in that neighborhood, there was also a guy named Benjamin Andres Castillo. At 18 years old, he lived just a few blocks from Sol's house, along with his mother Inés, an uncle, and the uncle's partner. Like many residents, just like Sol, he was a familiar face to everyone who walked through that area daily. Mind you, Benjamin wasn't as quiet a kid as Sol was. It's known that he had problems related to drug use, but that being said, he had never harmed anyone. With this context, we arrive at March 21, 2025. That day, Sol returned home from school just like she did every day. A few days earlier, she had just turned 13, and the day was going completely normally. Once at home, she decided to go out to a nearby store to buy some items for lunch. However, not finding what she had been asked for, she returned home and minutes later went back out to the same store. But this time, Sol didn't return. In fact, from that moment on, nothing more was heard of her. At first, the delay caught the attention of her mother and grandmother, but they thought maybe she had stayed to talk to someone. But as the minutes passed and Sol didn't show up, the anxiety turned into desperation. And the two women left the house to search the neighborhood streets. The search quickly mobilized the neighbors. Amidst shouts, calls, and door-to-door searches, dozens of people joined the effort. During these searches, they arrived at Benjamin's house, and the young man wouldn't let them in. He said he had seen Sol get on a motorcycle with a man and ride away. And at that moment, no one had any reason to doubt his story. However, in a short span of time, after being questioned by other neighbors, Benjamin changed his story, and this caught the attention of some people. And while all this was happening, Sol's mother went to the police station to file a missing persons report. From that moment on, the protocol was activated and various police units were alerted. They were asked to start patrolling the area and also to start talking to the neighbors. The family wasn't willing to wait. So alongside the official operations, with the help of friends and neighbors, they began to share Sol Celina's photo on social media, asking for help to find her. As the hours went by, the concern spread far beyond the neighborhood, and many people, not only in Chaco but throughout Argentina, began to follow the young girl's case very closely. The family's uncertainty would only last a few hours. That very afternoon, around 4 o'clock, the police received a call. They requested the urgent presence of officers at a home in the neighborhood. The person calling was Benjamin's mother. When they arrived at the scene, the officers found Sol's body. It was hidden in the house, covered with cardboard and crates. Benjamin was also at the scene and was arrested immediately and placed at the disposal of the justice system. Over the following days, there was extensive media coverage, and it was claimed that Benjamin had confessed what happened to an aunt, and that she had been the one to tell his mother, who then alerted the authorities. However, Benjamin's own mother gave a different version. She said her son had confessed directly to her. The woman hinted that at the time of the revelation, apparently aware of the gravity of his actions, Benjamin had tried to take his own life. Faced with this situation, she said she decided to contact the police. Perhaps the most striking thing about Benjamin's mother's statements was her subsequent stance. She apologized and expressed condolences to Sol's family, and assured that she wanted her son to answer to justice for what happened and face the consequences of his actions. Perhaps the most striking thing about Benjamin's mother's statements was her subsequent stance. She apologized and expressed condolences to Sol's family, and assured that she wanted her son to answer to justice for what happened and face the consequences of his actions. As expected, the news completely shocked the community, and as details of the case became known, Sol's family, friends, and neighbors began to gather in front of the house in question to demand justice. This caused tension to grow, and amidst the pain, outrage, and shock, authorities had to deploy a major security operation. A police cordon had to be formed around the area to prevent incidents and contain the crowd. At that moment, Benjamin had not yet been transferred to the police station, so the authorities feared that the neighbors would take justice into their own hands. Later, as best they could, amidst the crowd, he was taken to the forensic medicine headquarters for a medical examination. He was then held at a police facility while all the investigative measures progressed. As the hours went by, the preliminary results of all the forensic tests also began to be released. At that time, investigators ruled out that Sol had been a victim of sexual abuse, but the examinations confirmed she had multiple injuries, especially to her head and chest. In addition, they revealed signs consistent with an attempt at neck compression. Meanwhile, the young girl's loved ones flooded social media with farewell messages and expressions of grief. The pastor of the church she attended with her grandmother also remembered her with very affectionate words. In this context, solidarity campaigns were also launched to help the family in this difficult time, which included collecting food and contributions to cover basic expenses. The following day, March 22nd, Sol's wake was held at the church she attended, and after that, she received her final farewell. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to progress, and new details of the case began to emerge. The prosecutor in charge reported that at the time of his arrest, it could be seen that Benjamin had scratches on various parts of his body. These injuries were consistent with an attempt at self-defense.
Él estaba lesionado en la oreja, en la parte del cuello, rasguñones las venas se defendió mucho.
In parallel, the other teams continued working specifically at Benjamin's home. At this location, investigators seized a shock absorber which, according to initial hypotheses, was the weapon used to commit the crime. However, although progress was being made, many questions remained to be resolved. One of them was how Benjamin had managed to get Sol to enter his home. In that sense, investigators had not been able to determine if she had been forced or if he had convinced her with some deception. Among the hypotheses analyzed was the possibility that Sol had entered the place with the promise of seeing or receiving a kitten. However, this version could never be confirmed. What was established is that Benjamin had given at least 3 different versions of Sol's whereabouts during the hours she was being searched for by her family and neighbors. This behavior was highly highlighted by the prosecutor as a very important element in the investigation.
A la abuela Julia le había dicho una cosa, a esta señora le dijo otra, a la policía le dijo otra, o sea, se corroboró que había mentido en 3 oportunidades.
On the other hand, rumors began that there had been some romantic relationship between Benjamin and Sol, but really, with the testimonies available, nothing could be determined at that time. The case initially progressed under the classification of simple homicide, a charge that carries a sentence of 8 to 25 years in prison, and not as a gender-based crime where life imprisonment would apply. Let's remember that there was no sexual abuse either, and since there was no bond between them, the charge of femicide could not be used, which is why the classification of simple homicide was chosen. Meanwhile, given the shock generated by the case, authorities got involved in supporting the family, making mental health professionals available to support Sol's relatives. Several meetings were also held to express support and communicate that the state would act as a plaintiff in the case. The objective of this was to collaborate with the investigation by providing evidence. Just 4 days after the crime, on Tuesday the 25th, the first court appearance took place, and Benjamin refused to testify before the court. Following this, for some reason, the case was reclassified as double-qualified homicide for femicide and treachery. According to what was reported in the media, the government's intervention as a plaintiff had contributed to the modification of this charge. That same afternoon, Sol's family held a march to demand justice. During this event, her mother spoke to the media, saying she was deeply moved and expressing the profound pain she was going through. During this event, Sol's grandmother spoke to the media, saying she was deeply moved and reiterated her plea for justice. In addition, a new search was also ordered at Benjamin's house. During this second search, items of interest were collected, and a more detailed inspection of the scene was conducted. By then, investigators also had this man's cell phone, as well as some clothing items belonging to both him and Sol, which had to undergo forensic analysis. On the other hand, the prosecutor pointed out that the motive for the crime had not been determined at that point, but that all the gathered evidence reinforced the hypothesis that it was a gender-based crime.
Ahora, la motivación y todo refuerza la idea de que es un femicidio.
At that time, it was also not ruled out that the analysis of the cell phones would determine if there had been any exchange of messages between Sol and Benjamin, as well as the nature of those possible conversations. And that's because up to that point, the only certainty was that Sol and Benjamin knew each other because they were neighborhood friends.
Sabemos que ha habido algún tipo de conversación, alguna relación de amistad entre como vecinos o como amigos del barrio. O sea, esa es nuestra teoría en principio.
Also around those days, some versions appeared in some newspapers claiming that Sol frequented Benjamin's residence. However, the prosecutor categorically denied that information. In addition, she also relied on the accounts of the young girl's family and close friends, who said she didn't really visit any neighbors, that she was a girl very dedicated to her studies and committed to caring for her grandmother, and for that reason she hardly ever went out. There was also talk that most neighbors had a very positive image of Benjamin, despite the fact that, as we already said, he was an addict. This explained the shock that his involvement in the crime had caused. However, a detail was also revealed that was unknown to many people. This man had a criminal record. It was specified that it dated back to the previous year and was linked to an episode of domestic violence. According to the file, Benjamin had reacted violently against his grandfather.
Tiene antecedentes de violencia previa el año pasado donde reaccionó violentamente contra su abuelo.
It was specified that it dated back to the previous year and was linked to an episode of domestic violence. According to the file, Benjamin had reacted violently against his grandfather.
He has of period of violence last year. He reacted violently against his grandfather.
Thus, a month after the crime, the investigation continued to progress and Benjamin remained in preventive detention. At that point, there were still many questions that no one could answer. The main one had to do with the moments prior to the attack, and that's because, as we already said, many neighbors and also investigators didn't understand how Sol had entered this man's house. A neighbor agreed to give her first impressions and said it was hard to understand how something could have happened in a place where everyone knew each other. Everything was very quiet, and the presence of people was constant. On the other hand, the case also impacted both families, because both the residence where Sol lived and Benjamin's were left empty. Some of the man's relatives left out of fear of possible retaliation, and Saul's family left because they couldn't bear the weight of the memories. By March 2026, the case entered a decisive stage. The lawyer for Saul's family indicated that they were waiting for the case to be sent to trial, and that it was projected to take place in the second half of the year. It was also said that Saul's family would not accept a plea bargain, and that they would insist on the maximum penalty for Benjamin. The lawyer also explained that this man had undergone various psychiatric evaluations, and that the most recent reports indicated that he fully understood the criminality of his actions, and was fit to face a trial. Additionally, as of the making of this video in June 2026, some results of the forensic analysis on the social media communications of Saul and Benjamin are still pending. And while the investigation moves toward the courts, the case continues to resonate in the community and Saul's family continues to wait for justice. And well guys, that's it for today's video. A very sad, very shocking case that is still waiting for justice. A family that, although they already have a suspect in jail, this person who is known to have taken Saul's life still doesn't have the answers they want. They don't have that justice they long for, and besides that, it's not really known what happened that afternoon. It's not known, as I say, if Saul and Benjamin had agreed to meet, something the family thinks might be the least viable option because she hardly ever went out and didn't hang out with boys from the neighborhood. But the question remains of how she entered that house. Did Benjamin trick her? Did he do it by force? But if it was by force, how could it be that no one noticed? Saul didn't scream, didn't kick. Really, as I say, there are many questions, and it's also not known what happened inside the house, what took place. If Benjamin wanted to abuse Saul, he didn't manage to do it, she surely resisted, and in that resistance, well, in the end, he ended up taking her life. There are many things that are still up in the air, and surely many questions that will never have an answer because the truth is only known by two people, Benjamin and Saul. Saul is no longer here to tell her story, and Benjamin has chosen not to speak. And from what can be seen, his defense will surely ask that he not be judged due to some psychiatric issues. We'll see what happens in these months. If you found this video informative, remember to leave a like, remember to subscribe if you haven't already. I update 3 or 4 times a week, and if you're subscribed, you'll get a notification every time I upload a video. Now see you in another case. Bye.